David, the shepherd who became the king of Israel, was sitting in his palace in Jerusalem, gazing at the city he so dearly loved. His eyes swept over the horizon, where the golden hills surrounding the city captured the soft light of the evening. The temple towers shone with an aura of sanctity, and the sound of prayers echoed through the streets as the people prepared for the night's rest. Despite the peace that reigned in Jerusalem, David's heart was restless. Since his youth, David had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. He had fought lions and bears while tending his father's sheep, defeated the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone, and overcome the intrigues of Saul, the king who had once pursued him relentlessly. Now, as king, he bore the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. The responsibility to protect and guide Israel was never far from his mind, even in moments of apparent tranquility. It was this restlessness that drove him to walk alone through the palace chambers, seeking some form of solace. He stopped at an open window, allowing the cool evening breeze to caress his face. "Lord," he murmured, "you brought me here. You made me king, but what more do you expect from me? What does the future hold for your people?" It was in this stillness, in this moment of deep introspection, that David was seized by a vision. The air around him seemed to vibrate, and a brilliant light, brighter than the midday sun, filled a room. David fell to his knees, overcome with fear and reverence. The presence of God was unmistakable, and he knew he was about to receive a message of utmost importance. In the vision, David saw the heavens open and an army of celestial beings descend, with flaming swords and gleaming shields. They formed ranks as if ready for battle. And then, the voice of God, powerful and resounding, echoed in his mind, "David, my servant, hear the words of your Lord. A great danger approaches you and your people. A shrewd and powerful enemy, driven by pride and disobedience, will rise up against Israel. This enemy is not like those you have faced before. He is cunning and seeks to destroy all that you have built in my name. But remember, victory will not come through the strength of your arms, but through unwavering faith in me." The vision vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving David breathless and his heart racing. The king remained on his knees, trying to process what he had just experienced. He knew that God never spoke in vain, and that this revelation was a solemn warning of an impending threat. In the days that followed, David was consumed by a profound internal conflict. As a leader, he was used to facing enemies with the strength of his troops and the cunning of his military strategy. But this time, God's warning was clear. This battle would be different. He found himself torn between following his instincts as a warrior or fully trusting in divine guidance, which seemed to require a level of faith he had never experienced before. David decided to call together the leading figures of Israel, including the prophets, priests, and his generals, to discuss the revelation he had received. He gathered them in the grand hall of the palace, a majestic space adorned with tapestries depicting the glorious victories of Israel's past. But as he looked at the faces of the men who had trusted in his leadership for so many years, David realized that their confidence was being challenged by the unknown. "My brothers," David began, his voice firm but carrying an unusual gravity, "the Lord has spoken to me of a great danger approaching. A powerful enemy, unlike any we have faced before, is about to rise against us. He is shrewd, manipulative, and his true strength lies in his desire to lead us away from our faith." Murmurs of concern spread through the hall. Men like Joab, David's most trusted general, looked at him with serious expressions. Joab had always been the first to act, to suggest decisive military action. But now, he felt that something different was being demanded of them all. "We should then prepare our defenses, my lord," Joab suggested, his gaze intense and focused. "We must call up our armies, reinforce the city walls, and be ready for battle. We cannot underestimate this enemy." David nodded slowly, understanding his general's concern. "Yes, Joab, we will take all necessary precautions." But the Lord was clear. This battle will not be won with swords and lances. We must trust in divine protection above all. Among those present was Nathan, the prophet who had advised David in critical moments in the past. He stood and, with a calm yet authoritative voice, said, "The Lord has taught us that the hardest battles are those we fight in our spirit. This enemy seeks not only our territory but our faith. He will attempt to sow doubt, fear, and disobedience in our hearts. We must prepare spiritually, just as we prepare physically." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he heard Nathan's words. They resonated with the truth of the revelation he had received. "Exactly, Nathan. Our strength lies in our faith, in our obedience to the Lord. Therefore, I command that all of Israel enter a period of prayer and fasting. We will seek divine guidance day and night, and place our trust in the Lord of hosts." The people of Israel, under David's leadership, entered an unprecedented state of spiritual preparation. The streets of Jerusalem, normally bustling with life and activity, were now filled with groups of people praying fervently. The temple became the center of a continuous vigil, with sacrifices offered and songs of worship echoing day and night. Men, women, and children gathered to seek God's protection and wisdom. Meanwhile, David did not neglect military preparations. He knew that God could act in unexpected ways and that being physically prepared was as important as being spiritually prepared. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, forging new weapons and armor, while soldiers were trained for combat. The walls of Jerusalem were reinforced, and the gates were fortified to withstand any attack. It was amid this atmosphere of tension and anticipation that the enemy revealed himself. A massive army appeared on the horizon, advancing towards Jerusalem. At the forefront of this army was an imposing man, riding a black horse. His armor gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes seemed like fiery sparks. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, a leader from the lands north of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was a man whose ambitions went beyond mere territorial conquest. He desired to be worshipped as a god among men. Nebuchadnezzar had conquered entire nations with his tactics of deception and terror. He not only used brute force but also manipulated his enemies, turning them against each other, destroying their alliances, and sowing chaos before launching his final attack. He believed that the human mind was his greatest weapon, and he used fear and doubt to weaken his opponents even before the fighting began. As he approached Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar sent messengers to the city, offering terms of surrender that at first glance seemed reasonable. He promised to spare the city and its people if they would submit to him and acknowledge his authority. The messengers, dressed in luxurious garments, were received by David and his advisors in the throne room. The great Nebuchadnezzar, Lord of the nations and conqueror of kings, sends his greetings to the King of Israel, said the head of the messengers, his voice both seductive and threatening. He wishes to spare your people from suffering and destruction. All he asks is your loyalty and acceptance of his authority. In return, he will ensure that Jerusalem flourishes as never before, under his protection. David listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the messenger. He perceived the poison hidden in Nebuchadnezzar's words, an attempt to destabilize the faith of his people and weaken their resolve. He knew that yielding to this proposal would mean more than losing freedom. It would mean betraying the faith that had sustained Israel since the days of Abraham. After a long pause, David rose from his throne, the majesty of his presence evident in every movement. "Tell your master," he said, his voice firm and filled with conviction, "that the God of Israel is our only sovereign. We will not bow to any man, for our faith and loyalty belong to the Lord, creator of heaven and earth. If Nebuchadnezzar wishes to test us, let him come with all his might. But know that he will face not only the army of Israel but the very God who protects us." The messenger, taken aback by David's determination, hesitated for a moment before making a forced bow and leaving. David's words had been spoken with such authority that even the advisors present felt the power of the faith that underpinned them. Yet the reality of the situation remained. A vast army was at the gates of Jerusalem, and the city needed to prepare for battle. Nebuchadnezzar, upon receiving David's response, smiled coldly. He was accustomed to kings who resisted before eventually succumbing to fear and despair. "Let them trust in their God," he said to his commanders. "Soon they will see that no celestial power can resist my will. When the walls of Jerusalem fall, they will beg for mercy, and then I will be the God they seek in their desperation." Within Jerusalem, David was gathered with his advisors and military leaders. There was a palpable tension in the air as everyone awaited the king's final word. Joab, always the pragmatist, did not hide his concern. "My lord," he began, "Nebuchadnezzar is a relentless enemy. His forces are numerous, and his tactics are known for sowing chaos and disorder. We need a plan that allows us to withstand this siege, or else." "I know Joab," David interrupted, his voice revealing both determination and the weight he carried in his heart. "But I do not rely solely on military plans. I trust in the Lord, who has brought us this far. He will protect us, as he always has." Even with this confidence, David knew he needed to calm his leaders and prepare the city for the worst. "Fortify the walls," he commanded. "Prepare the men to defend every stone of this city. But remember, our true strength comes from our faith." David, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, decided to spend that night in prayer. He climbed to the roof of his palace, where he could see the stars shining in the sky. In silence, he knelt and poured out his heart before God, seeking guidance and strength. He knew that despite all the preparation, what was to come would test his faith in a way he had never experienced before. As David prayed, God's presence seemed to envelop the environment. He felt a deep peace, as if an invisible hand was upon him, ensuring that everything would unfold according to the divine plan. And it was in this sacred communion that David received a new vision. He saw Nebuchadnezzar and his army camped outside Jerusalem. He saw the arrogant confidence in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes and how he despised the God of Israel. But then, the vision changed. David saw a storm forming on the horizon, a powerful and merciless wind sweeping through the enemy's tents and fires. Neburai's forces began to become disorganized, and a darkness, denser than night, enveloped the army. In the center of this darkness, David saw an imposing figure. Not a man, but a divine presence, surrounded by light and fire, beginning to destroy the ranks of the enemy. David awoke from the vision with his heart pounding, but with a new certainty in his soul. He knew that the battle was in God's hands, and that victory would come in a way no man could predict. The next morning, David rose with renewed determination. He ordered that the priests lead the people in songs of praise and prayers, while he himself joined the army on the city walls. The king of Israel was ready to face the enemy, but his true trust was not in the walls or the weapons. It was in the God who had promised to fight alongside his people. And so, Jerusalem awaited the imminent attack, enveloped in a faith that seemed to defy reality. Neburai, on the other hand, began his advance, certain that the city would fall easily before his power. But he did not know that he was about to face not only men, but the very God of Israel. The approaching battle was like a storm forming, both in the physical and spiritual realms. Within Jerusalem, the city was in constant vigil. The inhabitants, from the oldest to the youngest, felt the weight of the moment. The streets, usually bustling, were now occupied by groups praying, people kneeling and supplicating, seeking divine protection and mercy. In the temple, priests offered incessant sacrifices, and the aroma of incense rose to the heavens, carrying the people's prayers. Amidst this atmosphere charged with expectation, David walked along the city walls, observing the enemy camp stretching across the valley in front of Jerusalem. The campfires of Neburai's army dotted the darkness like flaming eyes, watchful and threatening. He knew that the fight was inevitable, but in his heart, faith remained unshaken. The enemy, on the other hand, was impatient. Neburai was not a man accustomed to waiting. His strength had always lay in surprise, in the sudden attack that left his enemies disoriented and vulnerable. But Jerusalem was unlike the other cities he had conquered. Its walls were high and impenetrable, and the determination of its people, reinforced by deep faith, was something he had not encountered before. Neburai, seated in his tent, watched the city walls with a mixture of frustration and disdain. He knew the stories of the God of Israel, but to him, they were merely myths and legends, tales of a primitive people clinging to false hopes. They believe their God will protect them, he said to one of his captains with a cold smile. But when I break these walls and take the city, they will see that their faith is no match for my will. That night, as the silence of the dawn enveloped the camp, Neburai began to implement his plan. He ordered his men to dig tunnels under the walls of Jerusalem, a tactic that had worked in his previous campaigns. The goal was to undermine the foundations of the walls, allowing his infantry to break through the city's defenses in a surprise attack. He was certain that, with the element of surprise and numerical superiority, victory would be swift and decisive. David, however, was vigilant. He knew Neburai was cunning and would not attack conventionally. Therefore, he had placed sentinels at strategic points along the walls, instructing them to report any suspicious activity. And so, in the early hours of the morning, one of the sentinels heard the muffled sound of digging coming from beneath the walls. David was immediately informed. He went to the location with his generals and advisors, including Joab and Nathan. Hearing the sound of excavation, David understood what Neburai was trying to do. He knew he needed to act quickly to thwart the enemy's plan. "Seal the tunnels with stones and earth," David ordered. "Do not let them reach our walls. And be prepared, for the attack will come soon." David's men worked through the night, blocking the tunnels with every stone and debris they could find. They also prepared boiling oil and pitch to be poured on the invaders if they attempted to scale the walls. Every man, young or old, was ready to defend the city with his life. At dawn the next day, when Neburai realized his tunnels had been discovered and sealed, his rage knew no bounds. He decided to abandon the subtle strategy and opted for a frontal assault, throwing the full force of his army against Jerusalem. He ordered his men to prepare battering rams and siege towers, determined to break the city's walls with brute force. Neburai's army, a disciplined and fierce horde, advanced toward the walls of Jerusalem, with battering rams smashing against the city gates and arrows raining down on the defenders. The sound of metal against wood and stone echoed through the valley as the siege began in earnest. David, alongside his warriors, fought with courage, but always with prayer on his lips, seeking the strength that only God could provide. And then, as it seemed the siege could last for days, something began to change. The sky, which had been clear until then, started to fill with dark clouds. Strong winds began to blow, and the air became heavy with the imminence of a storm. David, fighting on the walls, paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. He felt a powerful presence, something beyond human understanding, and his heart was filled with an indescribable certainty. The storm that was forming was no ordinary storm. Lightning tore across the sky, followed by thunder that made the earth tremble. Rain began to fall torrentially, making the ground slippery and difficult to traverse. The enemy's campfires were extinguished, and the order Nebo-Rai had maintained with such rigor began to disintegrate into the chaos that followed. The siege towers, heavy and difficult to maneuver, got stuck in the mud, and the battering rams, soaked with water, lost their effectiveness. It was then that Nebo-Rai realized something was terribly wrong. He saw his men struggling to maintain formation but being impeded by the force of nature that seemed to conspire against them. This is not normal, he thought as he observed the growing storm. For the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his mind. Could the God of Israel really be intervening? Within the walls, the people of Jerusalem began to sense that the tide was turning. What had started as a fierce attack was now becoming a disaster for the enemy. David's and his people's faith was strengthened, and they continued to fight, not only against men but with the confidence that they were being protected by something greater. Nebo-Rai, feeling that he was losing control, tried to reorganize his troops, but every attempt was thwarted by the elements that seemed to be under the command of a divine will. Soldiers, terrified and unsure how to combat such a powerful storm, began to retreat. What had once been a disciplined army was now on the brink of panic. David watched all of this from the walls and, despite the confusion that was taking over the enemy camp, he knew it was not the time to lower his guard. He ordered his archers to keep firing and his soldiers to be ready to repel any new assault. But the truth was that Nebo-Rai was losing the battle, not only against the Israelites but against God himself. As the storm reached its peak, a massive lightning bolt struck the ground in the middle of the enemy camp. The impact was so violent that many soldiers were thrown to the ground, stunned and injured. The darkness of the storm seemed to swallow everything around, and Nebo-Rai, realizing that his position was untenable, finally ordered a retreat. The great leader, who had conquered so many nations with his cunning and strength, was now fleeing in desperation. He and his men, demoralized and terrified, began to withdraw, leaving behind their battering rams, their siege towers, and even their dead. The victory that had seemed so certain at the start was now turning into a humiliating defeat. David, seeing the enemy in retreat, did not order an immediate pursuit. He knew that this victory was not just his but God's, and that he needed to prove nothing to the world. Instead, he knelt right there on the walls and began to pray, thanking God for the protection and victory. His men, seeing their king in prayer, did the same. Jerusalem was saved, not by the strength of arms but by the strength of faith. After the battle, David called the people together for a great celebration of thanksgiving in the temple. There, with hearts full of gratitude, they sang praises to the God who had intervened in such a miraculous way to protect his people. Sacrifices were offered, and the streets of Jerusalem, once filled with tension and fear, now resonated with the joy and peace that only a divine victory could bring. News of Nebo-Rai's defeat spread quickly through the surrounding lands. Nations that had once feared his power began to realize that something much greater was at work. The God of Israel, whose fame was already known, now revealed himself as an invincible protector. The stories of this victory became legends, told through generations, reminding everyone that the power of the Lord knows no bounds. As for David, he continued to rule Israel with wisdom and justice, always remembering that day when his faith was tested and proved true. He knew that, no matter the challenges ahead, he could always count on God's protection, for he was not merely a king of men, but a servant of the Lord, guided by the faith that had been his shield and sword. Thus, the story of the Battle of Jerusalem against Nebo-Rai became more than a tale of war. It became a testimony of an unwavering faith of a people and their king. A faith that withstood the storm, faced the impossible, and in the end, emerged victorious, showing all that, with God by your side, no enemy can prevail. After Nebo-Rai's humiliating retreat, the fields around Jerusalem fell silent, save for the cries of victory and praises echoing from the city walls. The inhabitants of Jerusalem, who had faced the terror of the siege and the uncertainties of battle, could now breathe a sigh of relief. The storm, which had been a clear sign of divine intervention, began to dissipate, leaving the sky clear and bright, as a promise of renewal and peace. However, David knew that the victory was not just an end but a beginning. Jerusalem had been saved, but the impact of that day would extend far beyond the city's walls. He summoned the elders, priests, and military leaders to a meeting in the palace. It was a moment for reflection, but also for preparation for the future. Today, we have seen the hand of God in action, David began, his voice laden with emotion. But we must remember that this victory is not just for us. It is a testimony to all nations. We must seize this moment to strengthen our faith, our unity, and our commitment to the commandments that have been given to us. The elders and priests agreed in unison. They knew that while the physical battle was won, the spiritual battle for the soul of Israel was an ongoing struggle. The city needed not only military protection but a spiritual renewal to ensure the people's loyalty to the God who had saved them. It was decided that a grand Thanksgiving festival would be held, not just to celebrate the victory but to rededicate the people of Israel to the service of God. David ordered that preparations begin immediately and that messengers be sent to all the tribes of Israel, summoning them to participate in this great event. Days before the festival, the temple was prepared with the utmost care. The priests, led by the high priest, purified the place with solemn rituals, and the altar was adorned with flowers, grains, and fruits from the new harvest, symbolizing the abundance that God had granted his people. David personally supervised the details, wanting every aspect of the celebration to be worthy of the God they worshipped. Meanwhile, the people of Jerusalem worked diligently to beautify the city. The streets were cleaned, homes decorated with garlands and flags, and the markets buzzed with activity as people prepared to welcome their brothers from other tribes. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew they were about to partake in an event that would be remembered in Israel forever. Finally, the day of the festival arrived. From dawn, groups of pilgrims began arriving in Jerusalem from all parts of the kingdom. The roads were filled with entire families carrying offerings and singing songs of praise as they made their way to the temple. It was a majestic sight, filling everyone's heart with joy and gratitude. When the sun was high, David, dressed in his royal robes, descended from the palace and went to the temple, where the great altar of sacrifice had been set up. Alongside him were the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence among them. The people, gathered around the temple, stood in reverent silence as the king took his place at the front. David raised his hands and began to pray aloud, his words resonating throughout the city. He thanked God for his protection, for guiding Israel through so many trials, and for granting the people a faith that could overcome any adversity. He asked for forgiveness for the sins of Israel, pleading that God continue to be merciful and guide his people in the path of righteousness. After the prayer, the priests began the sacrifices. The aroma of the burnt offerings rose to the heavens, mingled with the incense, as the people sang psalms of praise. It was a moment of profound spiritual connection, where each person, from the humblest of peasants to the king, felt God's presence as a living reality. As the afternoon fell, the festival's tone changed. The solemn atmosphere gave way to a celebration filled with joy. Groups of musicians began to play harps, cymbals, and flutes, and the people danced and sang in the streets. Grand feasts were organized in every neighborhood, with food and drink shared generously among all. The laughter of children, the sound of animated conversations, and the joyful music created an atmosphere of communion that touched everyone's soul. But the most anticipated moment was yet to come. As night fell, with the sky dotted with stars, David ascended to the temple again, this time with his harp. He had composed a new song, inspired by the recent events, and wished to share it with the people. As he began to play, a reverent silence fell over the crowd. The soft, emotion-filled notes flowed from his harp as he sang about God's faithfulness, the protection he had granted Israel, and the need to keep the flame of faith alive in every heart. David's song was a prayer, a plea, and a celebration all at once. When he finished, there was a moment of absolute silence, followed by an explosion of applause and praise. The people knew that those words, those notes, were more than just music. They were an expression of the deep and intimate relationship Israel had with their God. That night, as the festival continued, David retired to his quarters in the palace. He was tired but at peace. He knew he had done all he could to guide his people, and now he was confident that God would continue to protect and guide them. In his last prayer before sleep, he thanked God once more for the victory and asked for wisdom for the days to come. The Thanksgiving festival in Jerusalem became a landmark in Israel's history. Stories of that day were passed down through generations, reminding the people of the power of faith and the importance of staying true, even in the most difficult times. And although Neborai never dared to approach Jerusalem again, the true victory was the renewal of Israel's spirit, which, guided by its king and sustained by its faith, continued to prosper under God's protection. Thus, the story of David and the victory over Neborai remained an eternal symbol that, with faith and perseverance, any challenge can be overcome. No matter how strong the enemy or how dark the storm, those who trust in God will always find the light to guide them through the darkness. And that light, shining through the generations, would continue to illuminate the path of Israel, making it a beacon of hope and faith for the world.